Most of you know that's an iPhone, right? If you haven't done any of your homework, you know that 11 years ago this past month that was introduced. We didn't even know what it was before then. That's a newspaper. They've been around for over 100 years. The question for you is, in 11 years from now, as we're looking at 2030 coming down the pipe, will we know what that was? We have a Rotarian that goes unnoticed for his accomplishments. I've known Dennis Hetzel since he first joined the club, and I was impressed with him right away. We take our fellow Rotarians for granted. Dennis has held jobs as a president and executive director of the Ohio News Association, as a teacher at Temple and Penn State. He has been an editor in residence at Penn State. He has worked in newspapers, journalism, editing, publishing. I could keep going, but there's any discipline that involved the publishing of the printed word, he's probably done it. Now he spends a lot of his time talking to government officials, and you'll hear some more about that from him. But one of the tests I give to somebody that I'm going to introduce is to find some peers and what they had to say about him. And the most notable thing I found was that Dennis was selected by the Leadership Committee of the American Society of Newspaper Editors as one of a small number of American newspaper editors or publishers who stand out for leading their newsrooms to higher level of sustained journalistic achievement. This is the guy who's just been with us in our midst and goes largely unnoticed. So today, you'll hear from Dennis Hetzel.
What's on your table before I get into the talk, when you run a 501c3, which is our Ohio Coalition for Open Government, which is one of the 4 organizations under our umbrella, you never miss an opportunity to talk about it and ask for support. So this explains the important work that our Coalition for Open Government does to guarantee government transparency and openness in Ohio. So after you're done giving to the Rotary Foundation and you've still got a little leftover money at the end of the year, there's some stuff on your table about OCOG, and I'd appreciate you taking a look at it. I want to talk about 2 things today, not just what's going on in journalism, which is a lot more fun to talk about, but what's going on in the business of journalism, of local journalism in particularly. And the 2 go hand in hand, and I think people forget that sometime. When you're strong as a business, you can be strong as a media organization. And I know from experience, when I was the editor of the York Daily Record in Pennsylvania, we were involved in some coverage of what was called the York Riots case. Our mayor had been a young police officer in 1969 when 2 people were murdered in York. And the newspaper got involved in some very aggressive coverage that resulted in that case being reopened after decades. The community leaders, including the now governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, who I know well, actually sent an open letter to the owner of the newspaper trying to get me fired. So the point of that, and the owner stood up for the newsroom and stood up for the newspaper. When you make an advertiser mad about a story, and hopefully the story was fair and balanced, and if you're strong as a business and that guy comes in and says, hey, I'm pulling all my ads, hopefully you have a good discussion and an honorable discussion, but at the end of the day, you have to stand up for the newsroom if you felt the story was done with integrity. If you're not strong as a business, you can't do that. And so the 2 go hand in hand. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the good old days, but you know, this business reminds me a lot of education, maybe because I'm married to a retired educator, but it's a passion and a calling for the people that go into it. And you know, it's a really important business, and I don't think I have to explain that to this group. Although there was a lot more smoking in the old days, so not everything about the good old days was good necessarily. But this is different where we're at now. And this recent cartoon that Beeler did in the Dispatch after the shooting at the Annapolis Capitol, I think really sums that up. And it's kind of hard to read that, but it talks about, you know, shooting in the newsroom. I can't read that from this angle. Less civility, business challenges, et cetera, et cetera. My newsroom in York was laid out just like the Annapolis Capitol setup, so I could I could really relate to that. Today I'm doing workshops on security, both on and off site. You have reporters, you know, being spit at and having things thrown at them when they're, you know, when they're covering political rallies. Yeah, and I don't mean to get partisan. You know, I came of age during the Nixon era, you know, so, you know, political lying has always been part of it. But when you look at the conventions of journalism, this is different. You know, President Trump gave a speech in Montana a week ago, and the Washington Post fact-checked it, and of the 98 things he said in the speech, 76 of those were misleading or incorrect. We have a certain segment of the population that doesn't even care if stuff's factually accurate, and we can't even agree anymore in our country on what's factual. So the conventions of journalism, the values that, you know, I've tried to teach when I've taught journalism, that I tried, you know, our newsrooms try to follow, and I think most news organizations, not all, but most news organizations still try to follow, are challenged. There's just, you know, there's really no way, there's no way to deal with this. It's historic, and everyone's trying to figure out how do you deal with this environment that we're in. And if you're not scared, I think you should be, because it's a very difficult time that we're in. The one thing I do know for sure is my members, our newspapers in the state, are always going to rise to the occasion to cover major stories. Kind of a fun fact is that the Xenia Daily Gazette, I believe, is the smallest local daily paper to ever win a Pulitzer for local reporting, and they won one in 1974 for their coverage of the tornado, which was in the 75 Pulitzers. And there's the reporter at the time describes, you know, doing his story. He was probably typing it, I would imagine, in 1974 on a big old Royal typewriter or something. And he described, you know, doing it typing a story in a room had no roof, which is kind of similar to the Annapolis Capitol. I think some of you probably saw that picture of them in a parking garage in Annapolis with laptops around a pickup truck bed. You know, and that you know, notion of getting the paper out no matter what. You know, that ethic continues. What I worry about is not so much the ability to cover the big stories, because you always find a way to cover the big stories. It's the erosion of the resources to cover the everyday news. It's you give, you know, the scholarship photo for the Rotary Club. It's covering the school board. I never met a parent who didn't think the newspaper shouldn't be at the school board meeting. And we're seeing that capacity erode because of the challenges to the business model, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you know, it's sort of a race. You know, can our industry figure out the business model for local journalism in time before the resources decline, where the relevancy is an issue? And we're fortunate in Ohio, we don't have anything yet called a news desert. And there's been some research on this around the country that's pretty interesting. And a news desert is a community that really has no meaningful local coverage other than if it's a big story, the big out-of-town media will come swooping in, parachuting in, and I could tell you some stories about that. And what's left is your neighbor on Facebook, the curmudgeon with an axe to grind, or the government itself supplying the content and the coverage of, you know, what the school board did. And I think we'd all agree that's not healthy. And I worry about that. It's the everyday news, the bread and butter, and with all due respect to my friends in broadcast, they're not equipped to replace that. They have some of the same challenges we have. It just hasn't hit them as hard yet. And it's not in their DNA, and it probably wouldn't make good business sense for them to not only get into the big stories, but the granular slice of life coverage that's always been the bread and butter of newspapers. A bunch of University of Chicago economists just did a study on this, as economists will, and they looked at local government borrowing costs in communities that have lost newspapers versus similar communities that still have them. And they found that local government borrowing costs significantly increased for counties that have experienced a newspaper closure compared to geographically adjacent counties with similar characteristics. And they also found that other local government inefficiencies became more pronounced. And this mirrors some other things. And that's not to say that the local officials were corrupt, but without that watchdog role, this is the kind of thing that happens. And I remember covering many a meeting when I was a young reporter where I was the only person in the room, but I was a surrogate for thousands of people. So they were talking about spending $1 million on a new road program. They knew they weren't just talking to me. And again, we've got to find ways to keep that, or we're not going to be well served. I said this was a passion, and this struck me. This is Rod Baker. He's a friend of mine. I worked with him at the Cincinnati Enquirer. Rod's not a news guy, he's an ad guy. He's now the publisher of the small paper in Maysville, Kentucky. And he posted this the other week, and I'm not going to read it all, but I think the important point is our core mission is to be the local source of news and information in our community, nothing more, nothing less. I see what I do as being the steward of business that has been part of the fabric of my hometown for almost 160 years. You know, and this article nails it on the head. That kind of says it all. The article he's referring to is in The Economist last week, and this is when I talk about a nuanced look. The headline was, you know, small-town American newspapers are surprisingly resilient, and that's true. And I want to most of my members, probably not all, most of my members are still profitable, and while it's never going to be the kind of high-margin business it was in the good old days, it's still a profitable business. And the Economist article points out a number of reasons for the resiliency of the smaller and mid-market papers. The metro papers, like the Dispatch, and then the even larger papers, face many more challenges. So even though they have more resources, the competition for dollars in these markets is a lot more severe. Local papers have relationships. People know them. The businesses know them, and also the readers are very loyal. If you went up to Geauga County right now and talked to my publisher there, John Karlovac, whose family's owned that paper for years, it's a wonderful weekly newspaper, you'd be amazed, I think, at the loyalty and the support that he has. If you drove up the road to Marysville and talked to the Barron's family that owns the paper in Marysville, they would tell you business is pretty good. They're having a pretty good year. But the other factor is the economic health of the community. Marysville's got the Honda plant. It's a bedroom community now for Dublin and Columbus. They've got a lot of retail. Housing's growing. They do a good job at the newspaper. They're doing pretty well. You go down the road to Bellefontaine. They've kind of hollowed out their retail. It's Walmart and going over to Marysville to shop. They're not doing so well. So there's a lot of factors involved in success or failure, even in this environment we're in today. So what's really going on in terms of the business model? At the 10,000-foot level, it's the internet's killed you guys, and that's really a simplistic look. And I'll explain more about this slide in a second. The internet obviously was a huge factor, has been a huge factor, but it's not the only factor. You could almost do a business school case study, you know, on the failure of the newspaper industry to not have the vision and courage to blow up its business model. And we're not alone. I mean, American business history is filled with examples of other businesses that had a great business and, you know, didn't deal with the train coming down the track fast enough. Interestingly, most newspapers were first in their communities to get on the internet. I remember we were in Pennsylvania. We had a snowstorm. We literally could not deliver the paper. It was a huge blizzard, and that's when we were getting ready to launch. We thought this internet thing might be important, and we were getting ready to, unlike the fax newspaper, which I once thought was important, and we were getting ready to launch our website, and we couldn't get the paper out, so we said, well, let's pull the plug. And we did, or plug it in, I guess, and we launched the paper, and we called the radio and TV stations to let them know they could read the paper on the internet, the digital daily record. But and in most communities to this day, and it's not an eyeball problem, the local newspaper's website is the #1 source of local news and information. That's not true everywhere, but it is true in most American communities, and certainly is true in Ohio. What we didn't do was monetize it, and in part because we weren't willing to spend the money on the R&D and blow up our own business model, and we didn't see some of the things coming. And again, we're not alone. Contrast that to a company like Netflix. And this sounds so quaint now, but remember, Netflix had a business model where they were going to send you a DVD in an envelope, and I didn't have to go to Blockbuster. And they blew up Blockbuster. And when Reed Hastings, the CEO, said, well, I'm going to blow that up because streaming's coming, and people were like, what? you know? And I wish I'd bought about 500 shares in Netflix when everybody was beating up on that company. But it takes real vision and courage to do that. We didn't have it in our industry. We did some smart things, but not enough. But there's obviously even bigger factors. No matter what we had done, I don't think we would have stopped the emergence of Google and Facebook. And the reason Google and Facebook is a huge problem, and the reason we now call them a duopoly in our business, they control 70% of the spending on digital advertising, about 70%. So everybody that's left is fighting for crumbs. And for reasons that are kind of beyond the scope of the time we have, most internet advertising is low revenue, low margin business. And I can tell you that when you do a custom digital sales program, we have an affiliate that sells in places digital and print advertising, you're going to do more work on a custom digital program to sell a $5,000 campaign as you will to do a $50,000 print campaign. It's really tough. Everybody else is fighting for crumbs. So that's bad enough. When I should add, Amazon is coming on strong too. Advertising within Amazon is the next big gorilla that's going to come to take market share away from everybody else in digital. The other problem, and what makes this different than other competition in the past to newspapers, including radio, TV, motion pictures, Facebook and Google have no content creation costs. We're all creating their content for them for free. You're doing it, I'm doing it, and my newspapers are doing it, but it's not free for them to create it. So they're basically leeching off the content that others have created, and they found brilliant algorithms to aggregate that and sell advertising around it, and they now have 70% control of the market, which is a great business model. In fairness to them, I should say, they do some things. Google has the Google News Lab, and they send trainers around the country. We had them at our convention to teach journalists how to use Google tools and other tools to do better journalism. Facebook's working with publishers now to help them sell more subscriptions, et cetera. But these are rounding errors to these guys, what this stuff costs. I mean, we have to be honest about it, and it's a huge factor. The other thing going on, before I get too deep in the slide, I should say if you're looking for a car, you really should go to Lash Chevrolet first. But this shows what our major advertisers have to deal with today, and I know Bob would say this too. You've got to have, if you're a car dealer today, you got to have your own social media people. You got to be on cars.com. You got to be on Auto Trader. So to the extent you're still in the newspaper is getting a much smaller slice of the pie. And certainly in the auto industry, you see a lot of consolidation among dealers too. So here on Tansky's site, just on their homepage, you've got live chat, you've got search, you've got social media. And you expect this to be a good website. This isn't like, oh, it's cool, they're doing it. This is a core expectation for you as a consumer that when you go to that website, it's going to be really good. So our advertisers are also in the content business. So are funeral directors, so is Ohio State. They've got their own bloggers, their own e-blast, their own videographers. So we're actually competing with our major advertisers, and the major advertisers' budgets are being carved up in multiple ways. They have less to spend with us. On top of it, the internet has disrupted them, and of course that's no secret. A simple example would be H.H. Gregg, which has now been out of business for about a year and a half, 2 years. This is fake news. I'm making this number up. I don't know what it is. But I'm going to guess that when H.H. Gregg closed, that was probably a $500,000 or more account to the Dispatch, and probably about that much for each of the TV stations here. So you're the ad director at the Dispatch, now you got a $500,000 hole to fill. You got to sell a lot of ads to small businesses, to Bob's Pizza Shop, to make up for H.H. Gregg. And so this disruption caused by the internet also is affecting our traditional major accounts. So we've got to find new revenue streams. And that's what this next slide is about. What are we doing about it? What are we trying to figure out? With my lobbying hat on, I always tell the legislators, we're not looking for special treatment. Just don't make our jobs harder by like putting a sales tax on advertising or something. Let us figure it out because it's important. All 88 counties need good local journalism, whether it's print or digital. Physical newspapers are adjusting. Sandusky just announced they're going to drop their Sunday paper and go to a Saturday, Sunday weekend edition. The Daily down in Jackson County just merged with their paper in Vinton County. There's still a good weekly in Jackson County. Again, we don't have any news deserts, but you're going to continue to see adjustment because of the sheer cost of printing and distributing physical newspapers, along with the preference, obviously, for digital that's growing. There is no secret sauce for online local news sites. You know, Politico.com can charge you $1,500, $10,000 a year, whatever they charge, to have specialized newsletter for healthcare industry lobbyists. You know, you don't have really those opportunities on local news websites. And I'm unaware of any strictly local, online-only websites that are very successful financially. We have a few around the state that really are doing a nice job, but they're not particularly profitable, would be my guess, but there may be answers coming. I think micropayments are going to be helpful. Readers are going to have to be asked to pay more. There's no question about it, as traditional advertising, print and digital, kind of drops away. A simple micropayment solution would be an app. You've agreed that when you click on a link for any one of a number of media outlets that you're hit for 10 cents or 25 cents or something like that to read. That's coming. A lot of our members, the Dispatch is good at this, are really expanding the services they offer to businesses that leverage their expertise that are not traditional advertising. You can run their website, you can do their email marketing, you might even be able to do some of their back office type functions with the scale that you've got as part of a larger group. Event marketing is a big deal. The business newspapers are really good at this. That's kind of one of their major revenue streams, like at Columbus Business First, who really needs to join my organization, by the way, despite my numerous efforts to get them to do so, if you run into any of them. Strategic partnerships and special projects. This is where there may be a place for things like foundation support. I don't think that's the total answer. I'm really personally against foundations, nonprofits, government replacing the business model of a functional media outlet. But there is a place for it. The Dispatch did a project last year that was partially funded by the Columbus Foundation and labeled as such on the future of Columbus. That was very well done. You're going to see a lot more cooperation, consolidation, collaboration where it makes sense. From your point of view as a reader, yourvoiceohio.org is really a remarkable collaboration between broadcast and print outlets around the state to try to share content and do meaningful coverage, tied very much to what Nancy's talking about with civility and trying to have intelligent discussion about what kind of shape is our state and economically, what's our political climate, what's really dividing people. There's a lot of effort going on like that, more consolidation of back office functions. And as I said, something's got to give with the duopoly. Our industry has a bill in Congress right now. Who knows what Congress is going to do anything, but it would basically allow us to not run afoul of antitrust law, to bargain collectively as an industry with Google and Facebook to, get more than the crumbs they're throwing us. So I don't want to end on a half-empty note. I do want to remind everybody that, newspapers are still doing great journalism, and, the passion is there, the effort's there, I think the Dispatch is getting their Pulitzer territory. That's just my one man's opinion on the work they're doing on the cost of prescription drugs. These are really complicated, dense stories. They're not easy to do, and they're making it accessible and understandable, and I think they deserve a lot of kudos. This is important work. Cincinnati Enquirer won a Pulitzer last year for a remarkable piece of work covering the opioid epidemic in the Cincinnati metro area with a video that any public broadcasting station would be proud to show. It's that good. It's not just large papers. This is from Farm and Dairy, a weekly paper in Salem, Ohio. It's done tremendous work covering the opioid epidemic in rural parts of Ohio. Cleveland.com just build a 1 million name database to help you find out if you're in danger of being removed from the voter rolls for non-voting. I'm sure many of you have read the controversies around whether Ohio does too much or the right amount to restrict access to voting. And Secretary of State Husted liked it so much, he's going to adopt it for the state's voter website. And again, these are difficult jobs being done by journalists who are now data specialists that I think really contribute to the role you'd expect a local newspaper to play. So on that note, I'm right at 1 o'clock. I'm pretty proud of myself for doing that. So I'll open it up for questions, and thank you a lot for your time. Way in the back, Rick.
What can, let's take newspapers, what can a newspaper do that's a newspaper that operates with integrity as you would define it? What more can they do, if anything, to combat this notion of some people who I won't mention that media is the enemy of democracy?
That's such a complicated question. I think part of it has to start, there's that famous Pogo cartoon, we've met the enemy and he is us, that it's also about civility and, critical thinking skills. I mean, we're grown-ups. We can't just suck up everything we see on Facebook or Fox News or CNN, and, we just need to have little, BS meters on some of this stuff. People have to take seriously the idea, I really want to know the facts, and I think the politicians that are enabling this are complicit. And there's media organizations that are complicit in this. And, all we can do locally, we talk about this a lot among our members, is just do the best we can to educate, our audience about what we're doing and be open to criticism. And it's not perfect. It's journalism is very imperfect work. And when we make mistakes, we need to own them, explain what happened, and maybe be a little more out front about letting readers know about how the process works. One of the great things about the internet now, is that you can put up background material and source material in ways you never could in the past, so that people can judge for themselves, whether you did a good job. I used to call it framing when I would, lecture on this. If I'm writing a story about immigration and, my lead paragraph is, about, children being pulled out of their mother's arms, that's one thing. If my lead paragraph, is about the cost of this, is about, someone who came into this country and committed a crime and murdered someone, both of those anecdotes are factually accurate, but it changes the frame and your perception of the story completely. So, we have to be a lot more thoughtful. And, one of the things I worry about as we hollow out mid-level editors and reporters, there's less thought going into a lot of the journalism that I see being pushed out, even though it may be factually accurate. Thank you.
Dennis has been a fabulous contributing Rotarian, and he did us a real service to step in on less than 2 weeks' notice. Be the inspiration. This meeting's adjourned.